everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight on this very warm summer evening. I'm Caitlin, for those of you I haven't met. I'm the new director of the Zeeland Historical Society. So this is put on by the Zeeland Historical Society as part of our School Bell series. So our School Bell series aims to have local speakers speak on local topics so we can all educate each other and kind of share our passions as we're researching things together. So I wanted to tell you we do have 2 more School Bell series scheduled for this year. On August 12th at 10 o'clock a.m., so usually these are in the morning, but this one we're just trying out the evening. Here, I will be speaking on World War I at home and abroad. So we have some interesting information on the polar bear unit, which went overseas, and some other things. On October 14 at 10 o'clock a.m., there will be a talk called The Splendor of Faith, the renovation of the organ at Second Reformed Church. And that will be given by Gordon Bruns, who was the worship director there for many years and helped oversee that renovation. It's a $1 million organ, so you'll be able to learn about that and hear it played because we're actually going to have it hosted at Second Reformed Church, so we can hear the organ. So the one in August will be here, the one in October will be at Second Reformed Church, and this will all be on our website as well. I just want to give a plug to say if you're not a member, membership helps support events like this. We have some cards in the back. As a member, you also get 25% off renting this schoolhouse because we have private events here as well, and 20% off our store at the museum, and you get our timeline, which is a quarterly newsletter. We have some from the last edition in the back if you haven't seen that yet. So now I want to introduce our speaker. Tonight we have Michelle Hoogewind. Michelle is an accountant by day and a genealogist by night. she forgot my cake. What's your group?
Genealogy Study Group.
Genealogy Study Group. She's a member of the Genealogy Study Group and was assigned this project of trying to learn more about the Colonial Clock Building and went down a rabbit hole. So please join me in welcoming Michelle. If you have a phone, please make sure it's on mute.
Yeah, down a rabbit hole. That's exactly where I went. I want to thank everybody for coming out. I'm going to jump right into the presentation here. What we're going to talk about tonight, I'm going to give you a little more detail about how I ended up here. I'm going to throw somebody under the bus. I am going to give you a little bit about the building history from what I know. Not an expert, not going to claim to be an expert, but I did have a good time doing a little bit of research. So if some of you have more information, happy to hear it and happy to digest it. I am also going to talk a little bit about the tools that I use so that I can send you out into the world to do some of your own research, hoping to create some genealogists and historical researchers out there. By no means are these tools, you know, the be-all and end-all, but it was where I started. And then I'll finally wrap it up and give a little bit of a discussion. Thank you, Caitlin. So let's get into it. How did I get here? Well, I am a member of the Genealogy Study Group, and I had only been a member a very short time before this project came up. Our fearless leader, Megan, here in the front row. She is also on the board of the Zeeland Historical Society, and they often do projects to kind of help each other out. And so I got a call. And the call said, I'm going to give you the Colonial Clock Building, Michelle. 2 to 3 hours online tops, and it'll be done. So, 2 to 3 hours. How many of you remember Gilligan's Island? Yeah, that was a 3-hour tour that never ended. So, that's how I ended up here today. I'm going to sit down so that I can see my slides because I am advancing in age and can't see well. So yeah, about 40 hours into my research, I had friends that were saying, cut it off. We're sick of hearing about it, because it's all I talked about. And you completed the task probably 25 hours ago at minimum. So and oh, by the way, there was a deadline that I had to meet, so I did hand in a dossier or a folder that was, what, an inch or two thick, probably?
Yeah.
3
inches.
So there was quite a bit of information in there for them to utilize in the future, hopefully. So I want to also point out, I had no connection to this building. I had no connection to the Colonial Clock Company. I honestly grew up in Huntsville. I had very little connection to Zeeland. But, you know, I was going to be this wonderful person that I am and do this good for the community and take on this volunteer project. And I can honestly say this project gave me more than I gave it, even at 40 hours. So I'm gonna issue a little challenge at the end for all of you guys. So let's get started on the history, because that's probably why you're all here. You don't really want to hear me talk. So Mr. John Spijker, he was from Overijssel, Netherlands, not Overijssel over around the corner. He came to Zeeland and started making grandfather clocks in the late 1800s. His first location was on Lincoln Street, right behind the Huizinga store. After hiring, so he was becoming fairly well known. His clocks were becoming fairly well known. And there was a gentleman that went to Chicago, was talking with a bellboy over there. And the bellboy had aspirations to be a salesperson. So he came to Zeeland and he convinced Mr. Spijker to hire him as a salesperson. By all accounts, he was a darn good salesperson because he got hired, number one, and number two, he started selling clocks. And very shortly thereafter, sales were outdoing capacity for building them. So Mr. Spijker went to Zeeland State Bank for his loan, like all of us would do today. The president of the bank at the time, Christian Den Herder, didn't give him the loan, but he did see the potential in the business. So he brought together a group of local investors that included himself, Christian Den Herder, and I'm Dutch, but some of these names I'm not 100% sure I'm saying it right, so apologize in advance. Albert Lehuis, Dr. Thomas Huizinga, Henry de Kruijff, and John Van Eckelsen.
Vina Clausen. Vina Clausen.
Veen Clausen.
Vina, not Veen.
Veen, not Clausen.
Close enough.
There you go. Technically, my last name is Hoogewind too, but nobody gets that right either. So the incorporation of the company was in 1906, January 10, 1906. The official name was the Colonial Clock Manufacturing Company. They broke ground on their first building shortly thereafter. And the address of the first building was actually on Colonial Street. So that it ended up being on 201 Washington. It's common to have the names and addresses change over time. It is a researcher's worst nightmare, but very, very common. I don't think there was a lot of forethought of growth back at the time, and they just kind of did what they did and then went back and went, oh my gosh, we've got to have some organization to this. But in this case, I think it's actually when Colonial Street was closed off at Washington that they did the renaming, because it was originally on Colonial, and when they closed that off, they had to kind of give it a different address because it was no longer on Colonial at all. So this is a Sanborn map from 1908. It does show that we are on Washington and Colonial. Those are our cross streets. And then the Colonial Manufacturing Company is right there. That would be probably pretty close to what the original size was. There might have been a little bit smaller originally, but this is what it was in 1908. You can see that Colonial Avenue does go all the way through Washington to the north. So it is a through street at this point. Also pay attention over here to the Star Furniture Company. That's going to play a little bit prominent role in a future slide here coming up. So just a couple doors down, there's a, I believe it's a lumber company there in the middle. Sawmill? So this picture here is a view from the intersection of Colonial and Washington, looking at the entrance here on the corner. So Colonial, let's see if I can do this. Colonial goes this way, and Washington is going this way. That's left-handed, y'all. So yeah, that's a really neat picture of the early days there, about 1911, 1912. This one is 1912. This one is actually from, and I've got this note here, I've got to read this or I'll never get it right. It is from the east side looking west down Washington Avenue. So this is where the entrance approximately would be in general today, looking towards the end. So you can see it's a much smaller building. The original building was about the third of the size of what we see today. Love these old pictures. So, well, John Spiker was, by all accounts, a really grandfather clock designer. Businessman, maybe not so much. And after about a year, the company was struggling to make profits, and the investors were about ready to cut their losses and go home. As a last-ditch effort, they hired a gentleman out of Grand Rapids to run the company. That was a man by the name of Herman Miller. Some of you may recognize that name. So Herman ran the company for a number of years. Mr. Spiker wasn't real thrilled with this plan. He kind of liked having control of his own company. So he asked to be bought out, and they did. So Mr. Spiker moved on to other things, and the company was run by that original investment group. So you might say, when did Herman leave and form his own company? Well, he didn't. His son-in-law, and this was one of the rabbit holes, by the way. This was not part of the building. His son-in-law, DJ Dupree, bought the Star Furniture Company, that one that was 2 doors down from the Colonial Clock Company. And he started running that company and later renamed it the Herman Miller Company in honor of his father-in-law. The Herman Miller Company, I believe, spun off the Howard Miller Company, which was the clock division at the time. So Howard Miller is the son of Herman Miller. Oh, what a tangled what we weave. I said I'd love to be sitting at their Thanksgiving Day dinner when they were talking business at that point in time. From all accounts that I was able to find, Herman Miller never actually worked at Howard or Herman Miller. I'm sure he was an advisor to them. I'm sure he maybe helped finance some of it, but he never actually worked there, I don't believe. That was where I had to cut off my research and just move on with life again. So the expansion years, 1916, January 1916, the Grand Rapids Press reported yet another expansion. And the Sanborn map here shows that addition. You can see it more towards the corner there on Colonial and Washington Avenue. And by 1923, the expansion is continuing. They added an addition on the north side of the building, right along Colonial Avenue in the back. Then they added another addition near the boiler room there in the middle. And they also added an addition on the front side of this. East side, I guess technically, I say front, but east. It's worth noting that while touring the building, I actually saw these large doors. You can tell they were not made in today's world because they were well made. They were huge and imposing. So I asked during my tour, Brian Lancer of Anotech actually gave me a personal tour of the building. And he actually told me, you can kind of see, it's real hard, but right there is, this was part of the fire suppression system. So right there's a little pulley that was made of metal and melted at a very low rate of heat. Once melted, there was a connection over here that released, and then gravity pulled the door closed. So if they had any kind of fire, one section of the building would be closed off from the other section of the building, thus, you know, a fire prevention system. Sprinklers.
What gives it away when you're looking at the door? Most people, you don't see a level door and people roll it back and forth. Well, this one, it looks like the door hanger was drunk. No, the roller is on a slant.
The gravity
So when you
will
let go
close
of
it.
gravity, will pull it closed. It didn't require anybody to be there to seal off the building. Those things were popular in all kinds of manufacturing plants. And you can tell a fire door from a regular door because it slants down.
And you can tell an engineer from an accountant. So they also,
Just to back up what you were saying.
yeah, it does, it absolutely does. I was a little nervous about even putting that in there because I wasn't sure I was saying it correctly, to be honest with you. But they were so cool. So they also installed sprinkler systems once those became available, from what I was understanding. And by all accounts, it actually worked. I found no evidence of large fires. And Brian said that when he did his research at Innotech too, they found no evidence of large fires, which was very unusual. I mean, we're talking the early 1900s, and they were using all wood. So it's very unusual not to find some kind of fire activity that, it just shows that safety and fire control were a huge part of their plan as a business. So back to our maps again. Back to our maps again here. By 1934, there was an additional building built here. This is across Colonial, so this is Colonial Avenue here. And they built it across the street. And then this little thing right here is actually a bridge across the street, a walkway for the employees to connect to the two buildings without having to go outdoors. I'm told by Brian during his research that anybody that worked there or anybody that was in town during that time, this was like big news. This bridge was like, woo! You know, it was like a day at the fair when people went to see the bridge across the street. Which back in the day it probably was. At this point though, please note, Colonial Avenue is still open for business. Still going across the railroad tracks up here. Still doing its thing. So in 1935, Herman Miller retires from the Colonial Clock Company itself. Harmon Denherter, the son of the original investor, took over as president and manager. This photo around 1947 is just, I absolutely adore this one. It kind of shows it at its heyday. It's, you know, the smokestack is just plugging right along, and you know, you've got the name on the building. This is just vintage industrial for that age. In 1972, the Colonial Clock Company decided to expand into Grand Rapids. They bought a furniture company in Grand Rapids where they could start producing in there as well. I'm told it was a slower going Grand Rapids. Now, I'm currently living in Grand Rapids, so this is a little bit of an affront to me, but I'm told the workers weren't as skilled. And the factory itself here was built specifically for moving around grandfather clocks. The factory they bought over there was a furniture company. It didn't have, I guess there was like slides right in the ground where they could move the grandfather clock across the floor for easier production. And that furniture in that building in Grand Rapids didn't have that. So it was a little slower slog over there. So by 1974, most of the original investors were gone, but there was an heir to one of the originals, and I don't have it in my notes which one it was, but she passed away as well, and her estate was forced to be liquidated. None of the current investors in the Colonial Clock Company wanted to purchase those shares, so it forced a sale of the Colonial Clock Company itself. By the end of 1974, December 1974, Thomas Industries purchased the company and its assets. Well, the 70s were kind to grandfather clock manufacturers. Thomas Industries, yet again, didn't understand the value of skilled workers. They decided to move the plant in 1983, they shut down production here in Zeeland and they moved the plant to Kentwood, where I'm from. And again, workers weren't as skilled. The skilled tradesmen here in Zeeland didn't really want to make a lot of them didn't make the trek to Kentwood. And they lost some of their competitive edge that way, I believe. Along with a changing market, the market was changing. There was a lot more manufacturing of clocks, so there was a lot more competition. So by 1985, Thomas Industries had closed completely, and in 1984, they actually sold the building here in Zeeland to the Sly Furniture Company. Yet another name that's very familiar in this area. That was actually one that I had heard of, by the way. Yay me. '84, Sly takes over. They paint this blue band on the building, some of you may remember, and you can almost see the word Sly right there if you look really closely. There's a faint little painted sign there for Sly. I'm told this blue band was very noticeable to people in town, and people remember that quite a bit.
I bet.
Yes.
Question?
Mm-hmm.
All that brick makes me think it might be Vena-Clausen brick.
I'm told it was, but I have not found any direct evidence to support that. But it would make sense if they were an investor. I mean, you're not going to go to somebody else's if you've got money in it, so it made perfect sense. But I could find nothing to truly support that other than word of mouth. But what Sly did when they purchased it, they did huge renovations. They petitioned the city to close Colonial Avenue there in Washington, so this is when the street gets shut down. And they put a skin on the building. They wrapped both buildings and made them one building. So when you can see here, all the brick is inside there. It's just wrapped in the skin. And I believe this area right here is actually where Colonial comes through. But it stops now, and the entire building goes down the path. So they did that. The bridge that went over Colonial was encased in the building. So it's still there, but it's inside the building. It's a walkway still connecting the two sides of the building, but it's all indoors. This is what the building looked like when Intertech took over. They went through major renovations as well, creating a multi-use property that's both functional for today's needs as business owners and retail spots, but it also pays tribute to the past in a very tangible and beautiful way, as I'm going to show you. So this is conference room. I'm told that this was the former boiler room. When Intertech purchased the building, this was in rubble. This was completely down. I don't know if that is a technical term. Is that an engineering term? Engineering term.
We call it splat.
But the first instinct of the owners of Intertech was just to completely wipe it away. Their architects, however, said, no, 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 we have a vision. And I think it took a lot of guts to say, okay, we'll spend the money to build it back up and use your vision. So that's what they did. This is a gorgeous room. I have one issue with this room. I would be doing this. There would be no business for me. I wouldn't be paying attention to a stupid thing because there are just little nooks and crannies. I just love brick to begin with, so just looking at the brick patterns I'm a simple girl. This is the hallway, the main hallway. They even took time and effort. These things here, whoops, I bet I actually, oh, nope. I didn't this time, ha ha ha. These here on the wall are grandfather clock patterns that they found in the basement when they took over. They pulled some of those out and used them as wall art. It just blew me away that they cared so much. Then they went to eBay and
Yeah, because
what's the other one? eBay and Amazon and purchased grandfather clocks. They are lining the walls. Those stupid things are chiming all day long. Yet another thing that would drive me crazy if I had to work there. But it's a beautiful building. But yeah, so those are mine. Those were all trend clocks, slide clocks, and colonial clocks. So they were all clocks that were actually manufactured right there in that building. But they went out and found them and put them in the hallways there, which is so, so cool. Yeah, winding on one could take it, yeah, that should be a full-time maintenance job, couldn't it?
I have a question on trend clocks. Those of you that have grown up here, was that Van Tamelin's?
yes.
Yeah. I believe it was.
Wasn't
It was
that-
purchased by Slide.
Wasn't that down where the bike shop is now?
That's where it started, yes.
So did Colonial sweep them up, buy them out?
Slide it.
Slide it, okay.
Colonial had the opportunity and passed, and it went to
And
Slide.
Sly Building was Sly Lowry for a long time.
Yeah.
There was a man named Bill Lowry who was a partner of Sly. I went to Zeeland High and I saw that thing every day as I snuck across the street to the restaurant.
So the final interior shot I have here is of the mural. This is a mural that was commissioned by Innotek to put on the wall. It would be the wall where the Colonial Avenue used to come through. From the walkway, this is what you see facing like Washington Avenue. You can see they took some old photos and had somebody, paint this up on the wall. And they've got some old clocks back here. This is actually the Colonial Clock Building picture right in and of itself. But then all the people that worked at Colonial, they had those painted up on the wall as well. There's a plaque on the bridge that lists the names of the people that they could identify in that picture. So it does, this is truly the spot where the past meets the present in this building. It gives me goosebumps every time I think about it. When I stood there, it was really kind of, and again, no personal connection to any of this, just a rabbit hole.
Do you know who the people, the two guys in red on the top on the right are?
One of them is John Spiker.
The painter.
So
I don't
we
know.
have that photo in our collection, actually, at the museum. One of them is John Spiker, but it escapes me who the other man is. So that would be the founder, the cabinet maker. And actually on the left-hand side, that clock that looks like it's tied down, that's from a photograph of a float. Yeah,
Mhm.
so that's very cool. I love that.
Do you know what year that photo of all those workers was taken?
Well, if Spiker was still involved, it would have been very early on, probably 1906, 1907, 8, 9, maybe even 10, but it'd be very early on if Spiker's in the picture.
I think one of the cool things about Zeeland is the population, whatever the number was, there were always more workers working in the city at these plants, like Starr and Herman Miller and Howard Miller. So if you had 5,000 people in town, you had 7,000 people working at these plants.
Right, right. So, to talk about some of the tools that I used, one of the first things I went to is an online website called DSA Online. It's the property tax information website. And this is where I probably could have spent 2 to 3 hours, actually, if the information had been accurate. And I hope nobody here works at the City of Zeeland, but it's not accurate for this building. The first thing I noticed, I believe it said that it was built in the 1960s, and I kind of went, is that historic, really? And again, I knew nothing about the building, the company, nothing. And I'm like, that doesn't seem historic to me. And Megan's like, just keep digging, just keep digging. Okay. So next thing I went to, good old Google. It's surprising and scary at the same time what you can find on Google. And this is where I truly got the general history of what clockmaking meant to this town, colonial clock meant to this town, colonial clock manufacturing, what it was, how long it was in business. I mean, all those kinds of general details I found online. I also found, and the name of the website escapes me, but it was like a watch or a clock or a timepiece like society, and they had a newsletter with an article on the history of the Colonial Clock Building, of the Colonial Clock Company, and a lot of the history of the building was in that as well. That was a huge find. Then I started going to newspapers. And this was during COVID that I did all this research. So I had no access to the Zeeland, the local Zeeland papers because I couldn't get to the library. Unfortunately, that was not available to me. So I started thinking about, well, I have access to the Grand Rapids archives, the Grand Rapids Press archives, through my library membership at Kent District Library. So anything big is going to be captured by the Grand Rapids papers. It's not going to have the local, picnic sponsored by or stuff that might be in the Zeeland. But I was able to find the big dates of big happenings, the expansions, things like that. One thing I will say about newspapers is you have to get really good at narrowing your search properly. Searching for things within. I started out with Colonial. Well, I got every want ad for Colonial furniture that you can possibly just.
Couldn't you get on the Zeeland record site through the library?
Not without a library card, and I can't get a library card because I don't live in Zeeland.
Doesn't live here.
Oh, I'll give you my number anytime. There you go. They don't come around and check.
Make a quick announcement. The library actually granted the Zeeland Historical Society access to the Zeeland record with a barcode, so you can't check out books with it, but we do make that available to researchers in case anybody needs to look at the Zeeland record.
I thought it said online that I needed a card.
You need the barcode.
Oh.
And yes, we can provide that barcode.
I saw it there and I went, no, still can't get on.
Well, now we know each other.
Yeah, exactly.
Remember that for your next rabbit hole.
Yeah, I'm going to call everybody for my rabbit holes from now on. Y'all can just do my research. Well, maybe no more rabbit holes? I don't know. So then, in-person interviews. I was able to get a hold of there was on the website currently that Intertech has for the building. There was this little thing that said, for more information about the building, press here. So I did that, and I sent an email off to Intertech that said, hi, I'm Michelle, I'd like to know more about the building. And I'm sure they probably went, who is this crazy stalker woman? And so I got an email going, what purpose do you want this information? I could just tell he was just like, yeah, okay, sure. And little did he know I wasn't a stalker, but I was crazy. But he invited me over to tour the building, so I did that. I got a lot of information from Brian Lancer there at Intertech. He had done a lot of research when they took over in order to really bring the building back to some of the original furnishings and original, what it used to be. The glory, yeah, exactly. He also, we ended up in the basement in this little room. And again, here I am, not knowing him either, and I'm in this room with this guy that I've never met. It was whatever. Took a day off of work to do all this. And he just started pulling things out of filing cabinets. Just started pulling all of his, nothing was organized, but I got a box full of pictures, typed up interviews, handwritten interviews, all of his research. He just pulled out, put in a box, and put in the back of my car and said, bring it back when you're done with it. Wow. And I said, I'm not in Grand Rapids anymore. Again, I grew up in Hudsonville, so I understand the concept here, but it was just like, wow, okay. So he was a wealth of information, and I was able to share some new information with him after I got done, which was really cool. What's that, man?
What's his name?
Brian Lancer from Nanotech. Yeah. And then the Sanborn maps. Let's talk a little bit about those. This was some of the new stuff that Brian hadn't seen. Sanborn maps were created back in the day by insurance companies. It was so that they could assess the fire liability of every building. So it talked about what the building's materials were, where the lighting structures were, where the boiler rooms were. They wanted to know everything, all the fire suppression systems in place. They wanted to know everything that was going to either make that a more desirable place to insure or a less desirable place to insure. That was what those maps that showed over time the changes were originally designed for, were originally made for. Today we use them for what I just showed you, all the changes over time, verifying that what you're reading in the newspaper is actually being seen, is actually true, because newspapers never print anything not true. But yeah, it just corroborates all the information that you're finding from other sources. So, and it's a really cool visual. Brian mentioned that he might take those and put them in frames and put them on the wall. So I was pretty proud that I made the wall with my research. Finally, there was a timeline that I put together. I didn't show that to you yet. I do have a brief picture here coming up. But timelines are something, again, that us genealogists use to, am I time-wise, am I going?
Oh, you're good.
Am I good? Okay.
You've got 1 to 2 hours.
I've got a couple of hours, yeah. Timelines are something that genealogists use all the time to kind of organize data in a very real way. For us, from a genealogy standpoint, if you're putting a timeline together for a person, it can show you where you have gaps in information and you need to go back and do more research. It can show you, it can help you distinguish. I have a grandfather named Tom Wilson. His father's name, guess what? Tom Wilson. Figuring out which Tom Wilson I find a record for can be difficult, but if you try to put that into a timeline, sometimes that can really help you determine which Tom Wilson you're actually dealing with. And 90% of the time, it's not even Tom Wilson I'm looking for, but it's a whole other story. And I could talk about timelines probably for 3 more days, so I'm gonna kind of shut up now, but let's just show you one. How about that? They can be done in Word, Excel. There are programs for them. There are apps for that, you know, as they say. But this is an Excel version. I'm an accountant. I use Excel. Sue me. Gives you your dates. And here, I think for this one, I just put years because that was as general as I needed to get. I gave a brief description of the information I found or of a picture, as you can see. And then I listed the source or the place that I found the information so that I could go back and find that information. You know, in that dossier of paperwork that I handed off to the society, they could kind of go through that and find what they needed to find if they were looking for something. So that's very generally, timelines can get much more detailed. They can get much more minutia-oriented. Yeah, minutia-oriented.
They grow and evolve.
They grow and evolve, they do. But it is something that, as in genealogy, we use all the time. So this was how my job became. I had gathered all the information, a lot of it from Brian, some online myself, but I had gathered all that data and I had to try to organize it somehow. This is the organization piece right here. This is how you can see how things happen over time. And ultimately, this became my presentation for tonight, in all honesty. I went through and picked out the pertinent details and put them into the presentation, and boom, 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 you know. Just a few hours later, I had a presentation. My 3-hour tour.
I love the picture on the bottom.
Yeah, bigger one of that?
Notice that's the clock in the mural.
Yeah. The float.
That's the float the doors is drawing.
Yeah, I don't have bigger, I don't.
So
Oh.
you found it in the stuff, and somebody found that to make a mural with.
It was in the stuff that Brian Lancer gave me at Innotech, yeah,
But
so.
whoever created the mural, the artist also was looking at that photo.
Yes, that was what Brian had given him to
But
create
in
the
the
mural.
photo, I think it's reversed.
That's not an actual clock, that's just a float, right?
That's right, right.
It's a float clock, yeah, I don't,
Is it made out of seeds and
I don't
flowers?
If you go to one of your first maps, you showed the area and across the street from the Colonial was the Zeeland Casket Company. And the saying was, when you went through there, you passed between time and eternity.
I've heard that before, I have heard that, somebody said that to me before. Now let's see if I can get this back. Oh! There we go. So as you can see, my quick little 3-hour tour took me on a journey that led me over time, across time continuums, to various places and led me here to you guys. As I said, I started this journey as kind of a I'm helping out the community kind of thing. I ended the journey with a renewed passion for my own personal genealogy. COVID took a lot of the wind out of my sails. This kind of put it back in many ways. And I say a lot, I apologize. I was able to practice my public speaking here with you guys. I gave this presentation to the Historical Society board via Zoom at one point too. So, you know, maybe volunteering isn't all about helping others. Maybe you get back a lot more than you give. So I guess my call to arms here is to encourage you, find a passion. If it's genealogy, Megan would love to talk to you. If it's not genealogy and history, find something else. If it's gardening, if it's crocheting, if it's working on cars, doesn't matter what it is, but don't just join, get involved, because you'll get more out of it than you ever imagined. If it's history, I'm sure the Historical Society people in the Decker Heights Museum would love to talk to you too. They're always looking for volunteers over there. So as a final, going back to our original building picture of, well, something today. I guess that's probably an older picture, but it's what it looks like today again. I definitely want to thank Brian Lancer at Innotech. As I said, the information I got from him was voluminous, and he was a wealth of information and knowledge. I do want to thank these two yahoos in the front here, Jim and Megan. They are constantly encouraging all of us in that genealogy study group to follow our passion and really support us in many, many ways. So thank you guys. I also want to thank Caitlin and the Historical Society. Let me get my thank yous out of here for inviting me here tonight. And then finally, all of you for coming tonight. You know, without you, I'm just talking to myself yet again, so.
Or the opposite.
Or the opposite, yes. I do have a coworker here tonight, the one with the baby in the back, and she can vouch. I do talk to myself an awful lot, so they never know if I'm trying to talk to somebody or just it myself, so. That's what, yeah.